let's have a word of prayer and then we can begin. Lord, we thank you for our time together tonight, and I do pray that you'll guide us and teach us and help us to know you better. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, so
Fine. I'm just going to stop talking to you. Fine. You're on your own.
we finished the previous chapter speaking about a Christian society, and that's kind of what we're gonna pick up on. You haven't been here for any of these, have you? Have you been doing the video?
Well, I tried to get to the big.
Oh, I didn't what?
Have you watched the videos?
Oh, no, I didn't know about them.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you go to the church's website,
Uh-huh.
you can find them
Oh, okay.
through that way.
Okay.
Oh, that's fine.
Come in,
I
Carol.
brought a visitor.
Oh, good deal. Come on in.
Hi.
Willis came a little early for the business meeting, so I said, just come on over and get Donna listened to. You might
Good deal.
actually like him.
I might learn something.
Okay, well we're studying this book, Mere Christianity. Are you familiar with it?
I've heard of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, sit with it.
It's written by C.S. Lewis, so we're close to halfway through, so we're making good progress. So we're in book number 3, chapter 4, which is page 88 in my book. So I'll read some excerpts here. I have said that we should never get a Christian society unless most of us became Christian individuals. That does not mean, of course, that we can put off doing anything about society until some imaginary date in the far future. So, we kind of like the theory probably of living in a Christian society, and so he's going to kind of guide us in that direction. But the first thing he says is we can't just wait for it to happen. We have to be about the work. So there's 2 things we should be working on. One is the job of seeing how do as you would be done by can be applied in detail to modern society. So essentially that's another way to state the golden rule, do as you would be done by. So the first thing he says is we need to look to ourselves and see how we can put this into practice day to day. Okay? And then the second thing he says is the job of becoming the sort of people who really would apply it if they saw how. So here he talks about the sort of people, and that's kind of a little phrase that he uses quite a bit, and he's going to get into that more about what he means by the sort of people, and so we'll get more of that as we go here. So the Christian idea of a good man. First of all, since Christian morality claims to be a technique of putting the human machine right, I think you would like to know how it is related to another technique which seems to have a similar claim, namely psychoanalysis, sort of, psychotherapy type of thing. And so he does, we did see this a week or two ago about how God made us to function with Him living through us. That is to say, we cannot be functioning and happy if we divorce ourselves from God. Jesus said, "I am the bread of life." That sort of thing. So now he's saying he's just going to talk a little bit here in this chapter about psychoanalysis, and there's some pretty good stuff here. First, he says that psychoanalysis is not contradictory to Christianity. But there are some differences. So he goes on, when a man makes a moral choice, 2 things are involved. Okay, and we talked last week about this business of making choices. So there's two parts to this. One is there's the act of choosing. And we're going to hear a lot more about choosing tonight. The other is the various feelings, impulses, and so on, which his psychological outfit presents him with and which are the raw materials of his choice. Okay, so the idea here is that, each of us has a certain makeup. There's I am me, different from you, etc. So we're not identical. We didn't come out of a Xerox machine. So, so there's the act of choosing, and then what transpires within us as we confront this choice. So now he's going to talk about the raw material. And he's going to talk about two different kinds of raw material. One is normal, the sort of the things that are common to most all of us. And then there are unnatural feelings. And so he describes them. Thus, the fear of things that are really dangerous would be an example of the first kind. Okay, we're all afraid of things that are really dangerous. Okay? If there were a rattlesnake in the middle of the room, we would all leave in a hurry because it's normal to be afraid of a rattlesnake. Then he says that then the other kind is an irrational fear, like an irrational fear of, say, spiders or something like that. Now, I know for myself, when I was a little kid, like elementary school age, I had a fear of snakes. But it was my fear of snakes, like if I was going to walk down by the creek or something, I wasn't simply watchful for snakes. In my mind, there was a snake waiting for me. Not waiting for just anybody. It was thinking about me, which is completely irrational, and I think I've outgrown that. So I do have a fear of snakes, but I no longer think that there's a snake out there who knows my name waiting for me. That would be irrational. So, and he goes on to say that psychoanalysis undertakes to remove the abnormal feelings and to improve this raw material, to get rid of a phobia or something like that. Now, I'm going to kind of skip over this whole page, which for me is page 90, but I was looking at, on YouTube, C.S. Lewis Doodle, which I know some of you have looked at. And the doodle for this chapter is really good. So he goes into a little bit more about this psychoanalysis thing. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to move along here. Human beings judge one another by their external actions. God judges them by their moral choices. Now, I was trying to think of how to, what is he talking about? Because I couldn't quite get the differentiation. And so then I thought about Jesus' story of the widow's mite. Okay? Externally, if we were watching the scene he talks about, one person comes in and gives a whole bunch of money, and then that person is followed by the widow who puts in, like a penny, a very small coin. So if we look at this, if we observe that scene, oh, well, he gave much more than she did. So that's the external action that we can observe. But then, Jesus has a deeper look at it, and he says, well, she gave more because it was a greater sacrifice. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the idea here between God judging us by the moral choice. She gave it all, whereas the rich man gave a small portion. Okay. So that is why Christians are told not to judge. We see only the results which a man's choices make out of his raw material. So we're back to this raw material, the kind of the normal things and the abnormal things. But God does not judge him on the raw material at all, but on what he has done with it. Most of the man's psychological makeup is probably due to his body. Now I had to think about that for a minute. And I think what he's talking about is that, my body includes my brain. and my brain can maybe have some distorted ideas or something like that. So my psychological makeup is probably due to this body. But when his body dies, all that will fall off of him. So then it's only my soul that remains. And then he goes on, the real central man, the thing that chose, that made the best or worst out of this material, will stand naked. Okay, so when all of this stuff goes away, you know, my soul will remain, and that's what's going to be left. Now here's, in the middle of that sentence, he talks about the real central man, the thing that chose. Okay, so it's the choosing that becomes key, and we're going to see a little bit more of that. Okay, and I think last week we talked about some of the virtues and how we need to develop better habits. You know, our choices become habits, which become who we really are. And so that's the theme that we're picking up on here. The second point, people often think of Christian morality as a kind of bargain in which God says, if you keep a lot of rules, I'll reward you, and if you don't, I'll do the other thing. I do not think that is the best way of looking at it. Okay? I think we'd all agree with that. Every time you make a choice, you are turning the central part of you, the part of you that chooses, into something a little different from what it was before. And that's worth pondering. Okay? You know, there's an inner me and there's an inner you, and that's the thing that's going to remain when this body is gone. So he's saying that when we make a choice, and we make choices all the time, it changes us internally. It changes this inner man, this person that we really are.
But I think it also, you know, how you was brought up as a child. If you've been taught early on,
Mm-hmm.
you know, not as an adult here, you know.
Right.
I'm sure you have a lot of your values learned, you
Mhm.
know, from adult that is teaching you, your
Mhm.
parents.
Mhm. Right. And again, I think what he's trying to say is that whatever this raw material is that we were born with, or we developed based on how we were raised or something like that, that's what we have to work with. And so it's still, we're still making choices, whether that's good material or not so good material.
Because a child that is left alone without any contact, you know, would hardly survive.
Mhm.
You know, they have, you know, poor survival if, you know, like a newborn that you interact with, you know, then, you know, less than a year old and one less than you just feed them, even if you feed them 3 times a day, but you don't interact with that child.
Mhm.
The development of that child will be different than the one that you.
Right. And I think what he's trying to say is, regardless of what baggage we have, we're still making choices. And granted, that person would be disadvantaged in making good choices, to be sure. And taking your life as a whole, with all your innumerable choices, all your life long, you are slowly turning the central thing either into a heavenly creature or into a hellish creature. Either into a creature that is in harmony with God and with other creatures and with itself, or else into one that is in a state of war and hatred with God and with its fellow creatures and with itself. So how important is, how important are the choices we make? Well, they continually realign this internal person, okay? So if we're making correct choices, that improves us internally, and if we're making poor choices, it does the opposite effect. To be one kind of creature is heaven. That is, it is joy and peace and knowledge and power. To be the other means madness, horror, idiocy, rage, impotence, and eternal loneliness. That's pretty grim. Now here's the clincher. Each of us at each moment is progressing to one state or the other. That's another thing worth pondering. And, you know, this is the sort of thing, if we get this into our heads, then as we make choices, okay, it kind of, like there are no small choices, if you look at it this way, okay? For those of you that were with us in Pilgrim's Progress, do you remember when Christian talked to the guy that was in the iron cage? And he's talking to this guy that's in an iron cage, and what are you doing here? Well, I've fallen from where I was, and it was a little bit indeterminate in terms of the story, but the implied effect of it was that if he had his mind right, he could get himself out of that cage. But he not only, his thinking kept him in the cage. And so I think that's sort of similar to this, where these choices we make lead us into one direction or the other. When a man is getting better, he understands more and more clearly the evil that is still in him. Now, none of us are young anymore, so I'm gonna suspect that perhaps you've had this same experience in your life, that as you get a little bit older, you come to grips more and more with how wretched you really can be. Okay, I may have come a long way, but there's still a lot of work to do. And that's really, and I think that would be the theme of Pilgrim's Progress, where throughout the story, Christian had his ups and downs, and he'd get off the path and get back on the path, etc., etc. But then even as he crossed that river of death, he had a hard time. He was terribly frightened, whereas his traveling companion, Hopeful, was holding his hand. No, it's not that bad. It's not that bad. And so his head's out of the water, and Christian keeps sinking, and he's trying to pull him through. Because, for all the progress Christian made, it really wasn't finished yet. I mean, there were still things that he was plagued with, fears, etc., that he had. So, and then the opposite of that, when a man is getting worse, he understands his badness less and less. And I'm guessing you may have observed that yourself when someone's, they become more and more blind to things that are wrong. Good people know about both good and evil. Bad people do not know about either. So he's describing a really wretched person there. That
Wow, say that again? Good people know.
Good people know about both good and evil.
Good people.
Bad people do not know about either. And the scriptures teach us that
Yeah.
we
Nor
can
do
be
they care
blinded.
about it. Yeah.
That sort of thing.
Yeah.
Put a star by that on my book.
Yeah, I will.
Okay, that's the first chapter we're going to do tonight, so we're doing fine for time. The next chapter is called Sexual Morality. We must now consider Christian morality as regards sex, what Christians call the virtue of chastity. The Christian rule of chastity must not be confused with the social rule of modesty, i.e. propriety or decency. Okay, so he goes on to talk a little bit more about how, like how people dress. You know, and he uses the example of some South Sea island, you know, where women haven't hardly any clothes on at all. That's the custom. So that's normal for them, and that has nothing to do with chastity. Okay, two
You
different
don't
things.
have any material at all to make a dress.
Of course.
Besides, it's hot there.
But with respect to dressing modestly, he does say, for it is uncharitable to take pleasure in making other people uncomfortable. So we've been around folks who do make us uncomfortable by how they dress, and we can't say that it's uncharitable on their part to do that. Okay. Charity is the most unpopular of the Christian virtues. Did I say charity? I meant chastity.
Oh,
Charity's not all that popular either. Chastity.
Except on February the 14th.
She got a plug in.
So he explains it. He said either marriage with complete faithfulness to your partner, or else total abstinence. So that's the definition of Christian chastity. Now this is so difficult and so contrary to our instincts that obviously either Christianity is wrong or our sexual instinct, as it now is, has gone wrong. Okay? And we'll get into that a little bit more. The biological purpose of sex is children, just as the biological purpose of eating is to repair the body. Now, if we eat whenever we feel inclined, and just as much as we want, it is quite true most of us will eat too much, but not terrifically too much. And he's going to explain what terrifically too much means. Okay? But if a healthy young man indulged his sexual appetite whenever he felt inclined, and if each act produced a baby, then in 10 years he might easily populate a small village. Now the next line is pretty humorous. This appetite is ludicrous and this appetite is in ludicrous and preposterous excess of its function. Okay? He goes on, contraceptives have made sexual indulgence far less costly within marriage and far safer outside of it than ever before, and public opinion is less hostile to illicit unions and even to perversion than it had been since pagan times. Remember, he was making these broadcasts like 41 and 42. So he's saying at that time that things were on a decline then, and now we're 80 years later, and we can observe the continued trend. The reason why I must is that you and I, for the last 20 years, again, say from 1920 to 1940, have been fed all day long on good solid lies about sex. We have been told till one is sick of hearing it that sexual desire is in the same state as any of our other natural desires. Okay? I mean, we all have these natural desires, and so essentially he's saying the lie is that all these desires are equivalent. And that if only we abandon the silly old Victorian idea of hushing it up, everything in the garden will be lovely. It is not true. The moment you look at the facts and away from the propaganda, you will see that it is not. Okay? I don't think anything I've said so far is a surprise to anybody. There is nothing to be ashamed of in enjoying your food. Okay, we all agree with that. There would be everything to be ashamed of if half the world made food the main interest of their lives and spent their time looking at pictures of food and dribbling and smacking their lips. Of course, but the world has changed since he wrote this, because now we have the Food Channel on TV. And I know one family I know, they're on a steady diet of these cooking shows, because it's like competitions and judges and the whole bit. So I'm not sure this is such a good example anymore.
My wife is on the phone all the time looking at new recipes.
There you go. But does she feed you well?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well,
She feeds me well, but I'm on a diet now.
I can see why.
Yeah.
Okay, we go on. We grow up surrounded by propaganda in favor of unchastity. Another thing that we've all observed. There are people who want to keep our sex instinct inflamed in order to make money out of us.
You don't say.
A bit of an understatement. Isn't it?
This is news.
Yes.
But here's-
Everything that comes at us visually.
Yeah.
Mm-mm.
Because, of course, a man with an obsession is a man who has very little sales resistance. And of course, now the same thing, apply the same idea to many other things. We've got the home shopping network. We've got Amazon, where it's so easy to buy stuff. And, that's a pitfall for something, for some people. But it's the obsession that takes away our sales resistance. Okay, and so we're going to get a little bit more of that in our chapter here. A famous Christian long ago told us that when he was a young man, he prayed constantly for chastity. But years later, he realized that while his lips were saying, "Oh Lord, make me chaste," his heart had been secretly adding, "But please don't do it yet." That's all I'll say about that. Now we're going to dig a little bit deeper here. In the first place, our warped natures. Okay, let me back up a step. There are 3 reasons why it is now specifically difficult for us to desire, let alone achieve, complete chastity. Okay, there are obstacles to complete chastity, and he's going to tell us what these are. First, our warped natures. The devils who tempt us and all the contemporary propaganda for lust combine to make us feel that the desires we are resisting are so natural, so healthy, and so reasonable that it's almost perverse and abnormal to resist them. Now, I think that's consistent, like what you see on TV. Unchastity is just presented as normal, and to resist it looks unhealthy, etc. For any happiness, even in this world, quite a lot of restraint is going to be necessary. So let's just look at that sentence in isolation, apart from the chapter heading of this chapter. The chapter is about chastity. But for any happiness, quite a lot of restraint is going to be necessary. So you could apply that same thing to all sorts of subject matter, right? How we eat, Obviously, you haven't been restrained. if you're on a
Diet has not been that extreme.
But see, the idea here is, though, that for me to be happy, I need to restrain a lot of my desires.
Self-control is one of the fruit of the Spirit.
That's right, self-control. So the claim made by every desire, when it is strong, to be healthy and reasonable, counts for nothing. Every sane and civilized man must have some set of principles by which he chooses to reject some of his desires and to prevent others. Okay? So this is just a normal part of a happy life, is that, you know, of all the many urges that come our way, you know, we need to keep those in check and make better choices. Okay, we're back to the choices now. Okay, whether it's, well, I know, as an example, I know when I was growing up, sugar was a big part of my life, and my mother had no restraint on that. And you know, so I mean, I used to just eat piles of donuts and stuff. So I did have to, okay, I've got to slow this down a little bit. And there's a difference between myself and Laura. She didn't have the sweet tooth I did, so she was much more restrained, and so I kind of had to learn from her about how to behave myself better. And it is a healthier way to live, you know, just to lay off the sugar. So that's just an example of how a thing that I have had to put a check on in my own life. Now the second thing, and what we're talking about here is the things that lead us towards unchastity. In the second place, many people are deterred from seriously attempting Christian chastity because they think that it is impossible. Now, we saw this in Screw Tape Letters, and the subject was chastity again, where Screw Tape is telling Wormwood about how to tempt his patient, and with respect to the temptation of chastity, or the temptation towards unchastity, was, you know, if he's resisting you, you know, just stop tempting him, because because it's a temptation that can be resisted. Okay, and so he's telling us the same thing, just in a different format here.
Jesus also showed us that when he was tempted, you know, to turn a stone into bread. You know, it was a natural, you know, desire to, and you're hungry, you want something to eat, and he, you know, resisted that.
Right.
That we cannot live by bread alone.
Mm-hmm.
And then also power, you know, he resisted that too.
Right.
So, you know, I think God had put something in us, you know, to know what is wrong and what is right and what is enough and more than enough.
Right. And here again is, we need to stop believing the lie that it's impossible to resist these urges. Mm-hmm. And it goes beyond unchastity. You know, it's many different things: envy, pride, etc. And then he concludes this with, "It is wonderful what you can do when you have to." And so, you know, when you look at people that have been through really hard times, and you know they actually did things that, you know, I look and think, well, it's not possible to have done this. Well, but they did do it. And so part of what we need to condition ourselves to is that, you know, a lot of things are possible if we'll apply ourselves. We may indeed be sure that perfect chastity, like perfect charity, will not be attained by any mere human efforts. You must ask for God's help. So again, he's not saying that this is purely self-control. You know, it takes a desire. You know, we should want to resist whatever temptation or urge we have, but we also need to ask for God's help to do that. After each failure, ask forgiveness, pick yourself up, and try again. So his advice is that you need to attempt to resist whatever the urge is, and if you stumble, okay, well don't just keep declining, repent of it, ask for forgiveness, and then move on with your life.
Don, I've got a great niece, and I don't know if any of you have seen her ads in the Facebook. It's for something called DOUGH, DOUGHP, and it's dough that's in a container. Well, anyway, she's 31 now, but she started that company when she was 17, and she was an alcoholic at the time.
Oh, really?
And she struggled with that, and now she's got, part of the money she gets goes to companies and like AA and other
Okay.
people that help alcoholics, because she knows how she had to struggle to get over that, and she deals with it every day.
Right. It's
It's
a,
an ongoing
doesn't
thing.
leave-
The struggle
it doesn't leave
continues.
you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Neil, but she still deals with it, and
Right.
she's made a lot of money, and she's a
Yeah.
wonderful she was on the Shark Tank one night.
Really?
Yeah, she's a wonderful young lady.
yeah.
But I'm
Okay.
so proud of her for
Right.
dealing with
So,
that.
but I mean, she had a stumbling block, a temptation, and she somehow worked her way through it.
Right,
Okay. And
It's a daily thing,
yeah,
just like what Jesus, you have to crucify yourself every day.
Mhm.
that's right.
And again, what we talked about last week or the week before is, we don't own this body. We're just custodians, so we ought to take care of it. Very often, what God first helps us towards is not the virtue itself, but just the power to always try again. And I'm going to guess might have been her story as well. That the stumble but to keep trying. Which gets us back to that whole choosing business. I choose to continue to try to do better. I choose not to just wallow wherever I am. For however important chastity or courage or truthfulness or any other virtue may be, this process trains us in habits of the soul which are more important still. Okay, and if you'll, like, one of the things we talked about a couple of years ago in the virtues was that what we want is to develop these better habits, because there's a sense in which we are our habits. So if we can move away from the vices toward the virtues, make that our habit, then the choosing gets easier. And then we're back to the whole idea of realigning this inner self. Here's another great sentence. This whole business of attempting to make better choices. It cures our illusions about ourselves and teaches us to depend on God. So as we attempt to do better, and we stumble, and we repent, ask for forgiveness, and try again, we realize that, well, I'm not as good as I thought I
I'm
was.
gonna pray about those Girl Scout cookies. I bought some Girl Scout cookies, and I ate a whole thing of them.
You could have shared with us.
I confessed to her.
See, charity would have helped you.
Yeah.
Okay, and here it is. The only fatal thing is to sit down content with anything less than perfection. So he is advocating perfection. That is, we need to continue to be better, to be more aligned with God's will, etc., etc. Okay, then the third item, virtue, even attempted virtue, brings light. Indulgence brings fog.
So if I have a little halo on my head, that means I've resisted the Girl Scout cookies.
That's right. See, we're moving towards perfection. Because, see, even attempting at virtue brings light. If you simply indulge yourself, that brings fog. Finally, though I have had to speak at some length about sex, I want to make it clear as I possibly can that the center of Christian morality is not here. Okay, this is just one aspect of anyone's life. You know, remember the 7 deadly sins? Lust is one of them. Greed, envy, wrath, etc. So all of those comprise our Christian life. The sins of the flesh are bad, but they are the least bad of all sins. Now that may come as a bit of surprise to you.
Yeah, but sin is sin.
Sin is sin, but
And as of God, it's all the same. One is worse, but you know.
well, he's gonna talk about this a little bit more. You may have heard of the Divine Comedy, Dante's Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. I have not read these. These are big epic poems, but I have read about them, so I kind of, have the gist of some of these things. So, the first of the 3 is Inferno. So, Dante is a character in the poem that he wrote. So he has a guide, and they enter hell, and they descend into hell. And it gets deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. So what Lewis says here is consistent with what Dante said. So as they proceed deeper and deeper into hell, there are people who engaged in different sins. So the idea in Inferno is that there are different amounts of punishment for sin. Okay, now I'm not saying this is, I'm not promoting this as good theology or anything, but in the same way, see, Dante, the first level were the people that were unchaste, and as they went deeper and deeper, it was different sins that took them deeper into hell. Okay, so that's what I think. That's what Lewis is trying to say. The sins of the flesh are bad, but they're not the least.
Mm-hmm.
All the worst pleasures are purely spiritual. Okay, we're okay. These sins of the flesh are bad, but they're not the worst. The worst ones are purely spiritual. The pleasure of putting other people in the wrong, which I guess would be like, we don't exactly speak this way, but let's just say I falsely accuse people of something. If I gossip about somebody, that would be worse.
Well, Jesus said, when he was, he said, that, to be cursed is where you believed what was wrong and then taught it to others. It would have been better if a millstone was tied around your neck and thrown into the sea. So when you speak untruth and you know it's not true, and then teach others to do the same, he said that, in his opinion, you're better off dead. Mm-hmm. And so that's a pretty harsh, one of the harsh things that Jesus said about spiritual affairs.
Okay. Then he kind of has a laundry list here. So, putting other people in the wrong, bossing, patronizing, being a spoil sport, backbiting, the pleasures of power and hatred. Okay, so, and again, you've been on the receiving end of some things like that, and that's pretty bad.
It was testing time, so I had a different conference. So I was in the teachers' break room with some different teachers that I hadn't been around, and they were just talking about somebody else, and I'm going, wow,
Yeah, gossiping.
I wondered, yes, and I wondered what they were saying about me, you know, that was in my regular thing.
Yeah. Okay. For there are two things inside me competing with the human self which I must try to become. Okay, so the subject here is the human self I must try to become. And if you go back to the earlier this hour, you know, we talked about you know, that inner self which makes the choices. Okay. So the goal is to become this human self which I must try to become, elevating ourselves. There are two things. There's the animal self and the diabolical self. Okay? So the animal self would be when we just revert to like animalistic instincts. Okay, when we lower ourselves to you know, just the bodily functions only and nothing higher than that. But then there's the diabolical self. The diabolical self is the worst of the two. That is why a cold, self-righteous prig, we don't use the word prig very often. But that's, what does it mean?
Well,
Give
I
us
don't
the
know what
English
it is,
translation.
but it's, I've heard it often enough in Britain, but I just, bad person is.
It's a bad
all-
person.
Bad person is about all I took out of it.
That's right. So
It
so-
doesn't sound good though, I mean, you know.
kind of rhymes with pig. Okay, this is why a cold, self-righteous prig who goes regularly to church may be far nearer to hell than a prostitute.
That's true.
Okay, and we're talking about, you know, this inner person that's making choices. And again, go back to the previous chapter, you know, I'm working with the raw material that I have. Okay, so it's but his final sentence.
Because the prostitute could be doing it for, you know, survival.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the
Yeah.
other one, you know,
It's just self-righteous.
just self-righteous.
So then he says, but of course, it is better to be neither of them. Okay, so, but again, he's causing us to, you know, Lewis wants us to lift our eyes up and to do better, and not just make two undesirable choices. You know, live better, etc. Okay, so 50 minutes. That's pretty good. But we're not in such a hurry tonight because